When a young Texan woman fails to return home after a late night of waiting tables, her car is found abandoned and blood-stained in the notorious Texas killing fields. An unexpected lead results in the untangling of a twisted story in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up, this episode contains mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. With that being said, this is the revisited and enhanced edition of one of our early episodes, which features the unsolved case of Shelley Sikes. The original edition was recorded in 2020, and we've revisited and re-recorded this episode on her case in 2025. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening since the early days of Last Seen Alive have noticed, our production and audio quality has improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the best we knew how at the time. However, our best wasn't the best, and we've learned a lot since then. We want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So, we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes. I'm talking totally new recordings with any new info or updates included. And we'll be releasing these new episodes on what were previously our off Mondays. So, that means there will be an episode of Last Seen Alive airing every single Monday. It'll alternate between totally new cases we've never covered before, as usual, and revisited and remade episodes on the Mondays in between.
Yeah, when you were going through the intro to this episode, I was just remembering all of the little pieces and all of the details that really just grinded my gears about this case.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised that you remember a lot of the details. After all, this was a case in Texas.
It was our first Texas case, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was. Shelley Sikes was last seen alive on May 24th, 1986. She was 19 years old and lived in Texas City. Texas City is a town in coastal Texas on the shore of Galveston Bay and just across the water from Galveston itself. Shelley had just recently completed a semester of classes at the University of Texas in Austin. She was on the fence about whether she wanted to continue her education there in the fall or try something different. She had entrepreneurial aspirations. But either way, by May of 1986, classes were out for the summer and she was back home with her family in Texas City. The Galveston Bay area was a big draw for college students celebrating the end of spring semester, so there were a ton of other college-aged young adults flooding the area at the time. In particular, college students from all over the state had flocked to Galveston, looking to celebrate the end of a year, and for some, graduation, on the beach. On top of that, the day of her disappearance was Memorial Day, a holiday that's synonymous with crowded beaches. Shelley wasn't celebrating, though. Rather, she was hard at work. She'd landed a job waiting tables at an upscale seafood restaurant in Galveston, a place called Guido's. This job was a natural fit for Shelley, who was outgoing and social. During her senior year of high school, she'd won the Best Personality superlative, a testament to her friendly nature. She'd also won the Most Talented superlative, due largely to her passion for dance. In fact, it was her big dream to one day own and run a dance studio.
Don't think I said this in the original episode, but it just had a core memory unlocked, if you will.
Oh?
But that is actually a delicious and amazing restaurant. I just remembered a trip down there, and that was one of the go-to destinations that everyone was like, you have to go there. And we did.
Very popular. It's a family-run business that has been in operation for over 100 years. Meanwhile, waiting tables suited Shelley just fine. The place where she worked, Guido's, which has now been in operation for over a century, was and still is popular among diners due to its seafood offerings and ocean views. The restaurant looks out straight onto the beach, so diners, as well as front-of-house staff like Shelley, had a clear view of the surf rolling in as she worked that night. It wasn't a bad job as far as waiting tables goes. As anyone who's ever spent Memorial Day at the beach can surely imagine, that night would have been a busy one. The seaside was packed. Shelley worked late and left the restaurant just before midnight. Fortunately, the drive back to Texas City was a short one, only 15 minutes. So when she climbed into her blue Ford Pinto, she no doubt expected to be home before midnight. In reality, she never did make it home. midnight came and went, and her boyfriend, who she'd been planning to visit directly after work, quickly became alarmed when she didn't show. Shortly thereafter, he and Shelley's dad, Ed, set out to look for her. I imagine that their joint search was likely preceded by Shelley's boyfriend reaching out to her parents thinking that maybe she'd changed her mind and had gone home instead, only to be told that she hadn't.
Yeah, it's really logical. I mean, growing up in a tourist town in Texas, I know how busy Memorial Day weekends are. It's
absolutely slammed.
Generally record setting, and people are out late into the night. If you work in the service industry there, you are going to be running the entire time.
Absolutely.
So her being too tired after a shift to go to her boyfriend's and go home instead makes perfect sense. And it's not like this is modern day where you can just send a text.
Sure, it's very believable. In any case, though, both men were worried that something might have happened to Shelley because, like you said, it was Memorial Day weekend, very busy, and they knew that there were a lot of people out drinking on the beach and perhaps getting behind the wheel afterward. They probably worried that Shelley might have been involved in an accident. And of course, the year was 1986, so like you said, if something like that had happened, she had no cell phone to, just easily and quickly reach out to her loved ones. Unfortunately, what had happened to Shelley on her way home from work was far worse than mechanical trouble or even a collision, and it had been no accident. At approximately 2 a.m., Shelley's boyfriend spotted her blue Ford Pinto sitting alongside I-45, stuck in the mud by an access road just minutes from her home. He pulled over and hurried to the vehicle, but Shelley wasn't inside, nor was there any sign of her nearby. Alarmingly, though, the little blue Pinto's driver's side window had been smashed in, and the vehicle's interior was smeared red with blood. There was even blood on the exterior of the car, too, as if its occupant had been injured in an accident. But if that was what had happened, where was Shelley? Surely, if there had been a wreck and EMS and police had already cleared the scene, they would have had the car towed instead of leaving it to sit, bloody and with its wheels mired in mud. And if she'd been in such a bad accident, where was the other vehicle? And why had her purse, with the money she'd made that night, been left in her car? The scene didn't seem to make much sense, unless, of course, what had happened had been something much darker than a simple vehicle accident. On that note, the land stretching beyond the highway where Shelley's vehicle was found has a name, an unofficial one, but a well-known one nonetheless. The grassy, tree-dotted expanse of field crisscrossed with occasional dirt trails is nondescript, but notorious just the same. The rural acreage is collectively known as the Texas Killing Fields. Texas is a big state, and although it's home to some very large cities, it harbors even more undeveloped space. There's plenty of land in Texas that's objectively comparable to the specific tract of land I'm telling you about now, but the Killing Fields are unique. Not for their physical qualities, but because of how they've been used. And they've been used a lot, often by people with monstrous intent. The Killing Fields have no exact borders, but are largely considered to encompass the lands on either immediate side of a 50-mile stretch of I-45. Within the fields, there's a 25-acre heart that's been particularly heavily used. I did the math, and you'd have to multiply that 25-acre heart of the Texas Killing Fields almost 7 million times to equal the overall landmass of the state of Texas. So the Killing Fields are truly a postage stamp-sized sliver of real estate in the grand scheme of the Lone Star State. But the thing is, they attract murderers looking to dump bodies like moths to a flame.
Yeah, I don't think people really understand how big Texas is. I mean, you talk about 50 miles, and it sounds like a pretty sizable piece of land there.
It's really not, though.
No, when you're talking about that's less than an hour to drive, it's not very far.
Since 1970, at least 30 homicide victims' bodies have been found in the Texas Killing Fields. And that number is, statistically speaking, staggering. To help put this figure into perspective, consider this. According to a report from the Texas Department of Public Safety, in the year 2014, 4.4 murders took place in the state for every 100,000 Texans. Which means that if we only look at numbers and discount all other factors, the average Texan has a 0.04% chance of being murdered. The odds of being struck by lightning are significantly higher. So, murder itself is a rare way to die in Texas, and even when a Texan is murdered, that doesn't mean their body is going to be moved at all, let alone transported to a secondary location and dumped. And so for 30 plus different individuals to all be unfortunate enough to be murdered and then to also have their remains abandoned in this one geographically condensed little area of land, well, usually when you find ground that's had that much blood soak into it, it's a battlefield. Unlike a battlefield, though, almost all of the bodies that have been found in the Texas killing fields have belonged to girls or young women, mostly between the ages of 12 and 25. Time and time again, the fields have served as an open grave for young victims of femicide. As for why this particular stretch of land bordering Interstate 45 is so popular with body dumpers, well, its location almost certainly plays a large role. It's located between the large city of Houston and Galveston, which is a much smaller city but visited by millions each year. The killing fields have a rural, desolate feel despite their proximity to these population centers. A murderer could abscond from the city to the fields with a body or even a live victim, do what they'd come there to do in solitude, and then climb back into their vehicle and vanish into a nearby city or town. And for decades, that's exactly what murderers have done. If the collective energy of their victims were to haunt those fields, it would be female, it would be young, and it would be badly missed by the families left behind. These fields have long functioned as a place where offenders attempt to hide the evidence of their crimes against children and young women.
Yeah, so as you're going through this, it's drawing me back to the Rashawn Brazel episode we did a few weeks ago, and the difference here. In that episode, we talked about the necessity of somebody having to dismember their victims when they're in these like very crowded metropolitan cities.
Mm-hmm.
Because generally there's no access to like large masses of land that you can just easily move a body to.
Right. This is the opposite scenario that we're talking about here.
And especially for the time we're talking about right now, in the 80s, when there weren't a lot of people with cell phones, people could just pull off into this, turn off their lights, and nobody would really think anything about it. They wouldn't really assume anybody was out in the field dumping a body. For a lot of people, they'd probably even today just assume that was an abandoned vehicle if they were driving by it.
Right. Not to mention, back then, everyone wasn't being constantly tracked by their electronic devices like their phone or even our cars' computers nowadays. They're always marking our location, and that data can later be accessed by law enforcement. But back then, that wasn't the case, and cases were much harder to solve for it. And make no mistake, although 1986 was a long time before anyone had made a documentary about the killing fields, its reputation probably was not lost on the father and boyfriend who searched so diligently and immediately for Shelley. So finding her car in the location and in the state that they did probably felt like taking a cannonball to the gut. Days went by with no sign of Shelley, then weeks and then months. Eventually, an entire year passed. Despite diligent search efforts and a massive wave of media attention, no one had seen Shelley since she'd worked her last shift at Guido's. It was as if she'd disappeared, leaving nothing but her dried blood behind to signal that wherever she'd gone to, she had not gone willingly. And then, in June of 1987, just after the one-year anniversary of her disappearance, all of that changed when information reached investigators in the last way anyone had expected. More on that next. And now, back to Shelley's story. When 19-year-old Shelley's car was found in the Texas killing fields, abandoned and bloody with its driver's side window smashed out, investigators feared the worst. Despite the obvious signs of foul play, though, they were unable to pinpoint exactly what had happened to Shelley. They knew that she had likely been abducted. The smashed-in driver's side window and bloody interior and exterior of the car made that clear. But by whom and exactly for what purpose, they couldn't say. One of the tips they'd received early on in the investigation had come from a passing motorist and their passenger. According to reporting for the Galveston Daily News, those witnesses told investigators that on the night of Shelley's disappearance, they'd seen her car sitting there on the side of the road and that she had not been alone. According to the witnesses, a white male had been there as well and had gotten out of his own vehicle before punching and then kicking the driver's window to Shelley's car and dragging her out of it and forcing her into his truck. The witnesses had watched the man drive away erratically, veering back and forth between lanes and cutting off other vehicles as he sped down the highway with Shelley captive in his truck. Unfortunately, those witnesses hadn't reported what they'd seen that night, only later once they heard about what had happened to Shelley. And the reason they hadn't reported it, well, it's very unfortunate, and I would like to think that it's become pretty dated.
Every time we talk about this, it just It makes my blood boil. I'm so mad.
And you also hear about it a lot in cases from this year. So, according to that article published by the Galveston Daily News, the witnesses had not reported the violent abduction they'd witnessed because they'd assumed it had been an act of domestic violence and therefore a private matter, no matter how brutal.
It's such a bad excuse.
It's horrible. In any case, during the year following Shelley's disappearance, her family clung to the hope that she might still be alive, perhaps being held somewhere against her will. It was a terrible thought, but better than the alternative.
You know, one thing that just occurred to me is he was punching and kicking the driver's side window. I'm wondering if any of the blood on the vehicle on the exterior was from a laceration to his hand.
Most likely, yes. Investigators said at the time that whoever did this, he's going to have lacerations probably to his hand and or arm.
So that makes me think that there was potential for DNA recovery. And I wonder if there's, in the future, if they've saved any that they can submit again or have retested with modern techniques.
You know, I don't believe that they did. But fortunately, that has not really hindered this investigation, as we're about to get into.
Okay.
In June of 1987, just after the 1-year anniversary of her disappearance, a 911 dispatcher in El Paso, Texas, received a drunken phone call from a male who said, quote, "I think I know something about a girl that's missing in Galveston County," end quote. The dispatcher asked him what the girl's name was, and he answered Shelley Sikes. The man calling was named John King, and he went on to tell the dispatcher that on the night of Shelley's disappearance, he'd abducted her. He was confessing to the crime, he claimed, because he was about to kill himself. The dispatcher sent officers to King's location, and when they arrived, they found him alive and well and willing to talk. What he told them next was horrifying. I'll preface King's story by saying that Shelley was a very petite woman. She stood just 4 feet 11 inches tall. She weighed more than 90 pounds. There are a lot of children who are larger than that, so just keep her size in mind. King told police that he hadn't acted alone in the abduction. All day and well into the night that Memorial Day, while Shelley had been working, he'd been partying with a friend named Gerald Zwarst. Using the holiday as an excuse to celebrate, King and Zwarst had indulged in beer after beer and smoked marijuana laced with PCP. By the time midnight had rolled around, they'd both taken to the road together in a Ford pickup truck and had happened to see Shelley behind the wheel of her Pinto as she drove home after a long day at work.
Okay, so far it matches up with the story that we found out well after the fact.
Yes, from the witnesses. Now, what they did then had not been pre-planned, but rather a crime of opportunity. They'd seen Shelley, young, female, small, and alone, driving home after a long and grueling holiday shift at the restaurant, and they decided to harass her. She eventually flipped them off, which was well-deserved, and they responded by running her car off of the road and into the mud where it was later found stuck.
Okay.
King and Zwarst had then pulled over and gotten out of their truck. According to King, he was the one who'd approached Shelley, who'd been trapped in her car, and who had punched the driver's side window, causing it to shatter. After that, he'd reached through, unlocked the door, and dragged Shelley out by her hair. As I mentioned, some witnesses had seen all of this occur. In fact, there had been multiple passing motorists who'd watched it happen, and none of them had reported it that night, only much later after word about Shelley's abduction got out. And for all we know, there might have been even more motorists who never bothered to report what they'd seen.
So it really just makes my blood boil because the Texas state motto is literally friendship. And the thought that somebody just doesn't report this because they assume that the person beating on the window with a female inside just happens to have some authority or right to do it because they may be in a relationship, that is
right.
Exactly against that friendship motto.
That kind of attitude was very prevalent even just a couple decades ago. And here's the crux of it. For people with that attitude, for these witnesses, it was not the violence against women that was the problem or that was upsetting. It was the fact that the men who were committing the violence, they later found out, were not, a father figure, a romantic partner. They were okay with that kind of violence being perpetrated against women as long as it was by a man who had a right in their minds to do it. So this reduces the female victim to a piece of property wherein her owner, or for lack of a better term, or a man who has some sort of familial or relationship access to her, can do whatever he wants and they're fine with it because that's his right. And I think the idea of a stranger doing that same thing, what upsets people with this mindset is not that a woman is being subjected to terrible violence, but that the man who does it does not have the right to, that he's infringing on another man's piece of property. And it is a disgusting attitude that has no place in the modern world.
The fact that they just assumed it was a domestic violence relationship and that's why they waited, and it was after they found out that she was a missing person that they realized its importance. It's important to understand that that is the mentality that these people have.
Right. Fortunately, that mentality, I'm not saying it doesn't still exist. I'm sure it does, but it's becoming less common with time, which is a great thing.
And I mean, I understand people not wanting to get involved in a domestic violence situation. It's an incredibly dangerous situation, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't report it to police.
Right. Nobody's saying you have to insert yourself like Superman into the situation, right? Nonetheless, one of the witnesses who later ended up reporting the events had actually stopped and had confronted King. And when he'd asked what was going on, King had told him that it was family business and for him to go away. And then that's exactly what he did.
So I think that further just supports the mentality that they have.
Right. So Shelley, who was struggling and screaming for help as she was being dragged by her hair out of her car at that point, came that close to rescue. But that attitude that we just discussed stopped it. She would still be alive, probably, if that man hadn't just left.
Again, it's a disgrace to that friendship attitude of Texas. I am glad that they initially stopped, but I'm disappointed that family business is all that it took to get somebody to leave.
Right. All of a sudden, when that was brought up, the witness no longer cared enough to intervene or even to report it to police. Now, it's at this point in the story, the point after which Shelley was abducted, that things begin to get a little murky. We know that what we've discussed about the abduction so far is true because it was witnessed by multiple people who are all telling the same story. But the same is not true for what happened next. It was all much more clandestine. According to what King told police, at least, after the abduction, both he and his friend Zwarst sexually assaulted Shelley before beating her to death with a shovel before burying her in a shallow grave. Only during the burial, they'd realized that something was wrong, that the earth was moving. Shelley had not been dead, after all, so they beat the ground until all movement ceased. Naturally, police had a lot of questions, both for King and his alleged accomplice, Zwarst. In a likely effort to lessen the severity of his own eventual punishment, King agreed to assist police by wearing a wire while stopping by Zwarst's apartment. The plan was for King to intentionally bring up the abduction and murder under the guise of casual conversation, which would hopefully get Zwarst to acknowledge his own role in the ordeal. However, when King got there, Zwarst was not interested in talking about it and nothing of use was recorded. No matter how many times King attempted to finesse or steer the conversation, Zwarst did not take the bait. So investigators decided that they'd ditch the attempt at subterfuge and simply ask Zwarst whether and how he'd been involved in Shelley's disappearance. They watched as King left the apartment, and soon afterward, Zwarst left too, along with his girlfriend, who, by the way, had been present the entire time, which probably explained why Zwarst had been so unwilling to take the bait and talk about the time he and King had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered someone. Police followed Zwarst's vehicle as he drove toward the small, nearby city of LaPorte. When he entered into the city limits, a LaPorte police officer in a marked unit initiated a traffic stop. It wasn't just the LaPorte Police Department on scene, though. A Galveston County Sheriff's Department sergeant was also there, along with an FBI special agent. Shelley's disappearance was a big deal, and authorities were working together to make sure the possible offenders did not slip through their fingers. At first, they told Zwarst simply that they wanted to ask him some questions. They didn't say about what. Zwarst agreed, and they didn't arrest him. They didn't have to. He went willingly with them to the police station. There, he was Mirandized and interviewed. During the interview, which was recorded on video, he admitted that he'd helped King abduct Shelley. Once they'd had Shelley in the truck, they'd pressed her down onto the floorboards. Then Zwarst had put a foot on her, holding her down. They'd then driven to Spillway Park, a Spartan local day-use area offering picnic tables and pleasant views, sandwiched between a lake and campgrounds. It was located in an unincorporated section of Galveston County and close to King's parents' house. During the night, it was a desolate place. Zwarst claimed that his memories of that night, and that the entire weekend for that matter, were hazy because of his heavy alcohol and drug consumption. But he said that he did remember some things.
I'm sure that he only remembered the most convenient pieces.
Well, it seems like he remembered quite a lot, actually. And I've got to interrupt myself here briefly to mention that during this interview, investigators paused to file a sworn probable cause affidavit so that they could charge Zworst with the aggravated kidnapping that he'd just admitted to. And when the camera began rolling again, they informed him of the charges against him and that he was then formally under arrest. And at that point, he stopped talking. He didn't stay silent for long, though. The next day, he agreed to go on a drive with investigators, guiding them along the route he and King had traveled during Shelley's abduction. After this, he started his story over again in another videoed interview session. According to what he told police that day, when he and King had arrived at the park, they'd moved Shelley, dazed and in pain after the beating they'd subjected her to, from the floor of the truck's cab to the truck's bed. Then, they'd driven a short distance to King's parents' house. There, they'd grabbed a shovel and had driven to another nearby house, which King had been renting at the time. Once at King's house, Zworst had, allegedly according to him, gone inside, downed some more beers, and helped himself to dinner. He claimed that King had remained outside of his own home the entire time that he did all this. And when Zworst had eventually emerged from his friend's home, he'd found that although the truck was still there, Shelley had vanished from its bed. In fact, she'd been nowhere to be seen. Only King and his shovel remained. Zworst allegedly had had no idea what King had done with Shelley. Now, after hearing both suspects' stories, investigators had even more questions. It was apparent that the men had abducted Shelley together after a day of binge drinking and drug use. They'd both admitted to that. But what had happened afterward? And most importantly, where was Shelley now? Had she really been mistakenly buried alive and fatally beaten through a layer of earth, or was that just a story? The sadness, the questions, and the half-truths, they all permeated the investigation with a dense fog of gut-wrenching uncertainty. Because at that point, although police didn't know where Shelley was, they knew that when and if she was found, she would not be found alive. On top of both men's confessions, in which each blamed the other for playing a larger role in the crime than they would admit to, police also received word of second-hand confessions from jail inmates. This was possible because shortly after Shelley's disappearance, Zworst had been arrested for driving under the influence. After a brief stint in jail, he'd been placed on probation, which he'd still been under at the time of his arrest for Shelley's abduction. After King and Zworst's arrest, investigators were told by two inmates that during his time in jail after his DUI arrest, Zworst had spoken to them about Shelley's abduction and murder. According to those inmates, Zworst had told them the same story about abducting Shelley with King's help, and of eventually arriving at the house King rented. There, Zworst claimed he'd passed out for a while and that when he'd woken up, he'd witnessed King beating Shelley over the head with a shovel and then burying her alive behind his house. By this point, although police didn't have all the details and half-truths ironed out, they knew that King and Zworst had both actively perpetrated a terrible crime. Even if they hadn't both participated in the fatal final beating or the burial, they'd both forcibly abducted and brutalized Shelley. In 1988, both King and Zworst were convicted of abducting Shelley, not of murdering her, just of abducting her. Even so, both received life sentences, and Shelley's remains still have not been recovered. After King and Zworst's convictions, even with the life sentences secured, what investigators wanted more than anything was to locate Shelley's body. In any homicide investigation, the victim's body is by far the most essential piece of evidence. Bodies tell stories, not just of how their owners lived, but of how and when they died. And investigators wanted that to really bring this case home and effectively prosecute the offenders not just for Shelley's abduction, but for her murder. Additionally, and most importantly, locating Shelley's remains would bring some degree of closure to her family and friends, and allow them to honor her memory by interring her remains with love and respect, rather than with the brutal violence and hatred that had characterized her careless burial in a shallow grave. So, investigators heavily pressured both offenders to reveal the location of Shelley's body. Eventually, they even offered them immunity from pending homicide charges if they disclosed her location, but considering that they were already serving life sentences, there was no real incentive. Certainly, decency or empathy for the family of their victim could have been an incentive if they cared about those things, but they did not. They lacked them entirely. Zworst, however, eventually did give in, perhaps because he feared, the death penalty if convicted of murder, and he agreed to reveal the location of Shelley's body. To do this, he underwent hypnosis and drew a map. The map led investigators to a field in San Leon, a census-designated area in Galveston County. Investigators went to the location and searched thoroughly for Shelley. They were unable to locate her remains, but they did find one very compelling piece of evidence.
Oh?
That item was a distinctive white blouse. Distinctive not just because of its very small size, but because it was handmade. Shelley had been a skilled seamstress, and even while attending school full-time and working hard serving tables over the summer, she'd found time to make her own clothing. And a white blouse is exactly the sort of top that many restaurant servers are required to wear at work, and is exactly what servers at Guido's wore at the time. Even today, if you check out the restaurant's Instagram, you'll see pictures of smiling servers wearing white, long-sleeved shirts under black vests. So it's easy to imagine that back in 1986, Shelley might have smiled while serving guests and wearing something similar.
That's exactly what I remember about that place, too.
Right. You know it's a nice restaurant when they make the staff wear white shirts instead of black. It says a lot. Investigators had the shirt forensically tested, hoping to find Shelley's DNA on the fabric. Unfortunately, they were unable to recover any DNA evidence. By that time, the shirt had presumably, if it was Shelley's anyway, been abandoned outdoors for years, allowing time and weather to erase any evidence of its owner. Still, the discovery was compelling. The small shirt wouldn't have fit most women, and the fact that it was handmade made it even more likely that it might have belonged to Shelley. Back at a Texas prison, after discovering that his map had failed to lead investigators to Shelley's remains, Zworst suggested that King had probably moved the body. Where he might have moved it to, Zworst claimed not to know. As for King, he was not talking. He never revealed the location of Shelley's body. In fact, he died in 2015, still refusing to disclose. He was 58 years old when he died of natural causes, and unfortunately, in a final act of cruelty, he took whatever knowledge he may have had of the location of Shelley's body with him to his own grave. When we aired our original episode on Shelley's case, Zworst was still alive and serving his life sentence in Huntsville, Texas, a town built around the prison industry that contains the Texas Department of Criminal Justice headquarters and numerous different correctional facilities.
I also believe that's where they conduct all of their death penalty executions.
Oh, is it?
I believe so.
Well, in any case, he's no longer there. In 2020, at age 66, Zworst was found unresponsive in his cell. He received medical attention but died soon after in the hospital. For Shelley's family, this means that they will finally no longer be subjected to having to attend parole hearings every few years in order to keep him behind bars. While this is a reprieve, they're still waiting to finally be able to lay Shelley to rest in the empty burial plot they've been maintaining for decades in hopes of bringing her home. So, if you know anything that may help investigators locate Shelley, please call the Galveston County Sheriff's Office at 409-766-2300. And if you consider this case to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved homicide of Margaret Carabetta. The two cases aren't related, but both involve the stories of teen girls or young women who were abducted and murdered. We aired our episode on Margaret's homicide in September of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Shelley's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.